May 13, 1985. Osage Avenue, West Philadelphia. It's a street like countless others in America. A quiet artery lined with brick row houses, where trees cast long shadows on the pavement in the late afternoon sun. The air is thick with the scent of spring blossoms, a deceptive calm that masks a tension coiled so tight it feels electric. For days, this neighborhood has been a pressure cooker, its residents trapped between an unyielding radical group and an increasingly militarized police force. But today, the simmering conflict is about to flash into a conflagration. From above, the rhythmic thumping of a helicopter's blades is the only sound that matters. It's not a news chopper observing from a safe distance. It is an instrument of the state, circling its target with predatory patience. Inside the aircraft, a decision, born of frustration and fury, is finalized. An order is given. A city official looks down upon his own city and gives the command to attack.
A satchel, a crude package of wood, metal, and 2 pounds of military-grade Tovex and C4 explosive is pushed from the helicopter. For a moment, it is a dark speck against the vast, indifferent blue sky. It falls, not on a foreign battlefield or a fortified enemy compound, but onto the roof of a home, 6221 Osage Avenue. The explosion is not a clean surgical strike. It is a deafening, visceral tear in the fabric of the neighborhood. A brutal roar that shatters windows, shakes foundations, and announces that a line has been irrevocably crossed. Fire erupts instantly, a hungry, indiscriminate beast unleashed. It licks at the rooftop, then devours it, spewing a column of thick, black smoke that rises like a funeral pyre. This was not an accident. This was not a last resort gone wrong. This was a deliberate act carried out by the Philadelphia Police Department against its own citizens. Inside that burning house were men, women, and children.
They were members of a radical back-to-nature organization known simply as MOVE, a group that preached a return to a primal state of being that rejected technology, government, and the very concept of modern society, which they saw as a corrupting, life-denying disease. How did it come to this? How did a commune of black liberationists and environmentalists living with their rescued dogs and their children become the epicenter of a conflict so extreme that a city decided to bomb itself? The story of MOVE is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a tangled, tragic knot of uncompromising ideology, unchecked state power, and a terrifying escalation of paranoia. It is the story of a family that saw itself as revolutionary prophets and a city that saw them as a cancerous growth that had to be excised at any cost. To understand the fire that consumed not just one house, but 61 others, leaving over 250 people homeless, we must look beyond the flames.
We must trace the origins of the smoke back to its source. We must go back to the beginning, to the charismatic and enigmatic man who called himself John Africa, and to the powerful, unbending ideals that would forge a family, build a movement, and ultimately lead a community to its own immolation. This is the story of a dream of liberation that became a nightmare of destruction, a cautionary tale etched forever in the ashes of a Philadelphia neighborhood. Philadelphia in the early 1970s was a city of ghosts. The ghosts of industry, of prosperity, of promises unkept. Its air, thick with the metallic scent of decay from abandoned factories, carried the constant, distant wail of sirens. For many, especially its black communities, it was a landscape of urban blight, a maze of crumbling brick and cracked pavement, policed with an iron fist. This was the era of Frank Rizzo, a former police commissioner who rose to become the city's mayor. a man whose name was synonymous with a brutal, confrontational style of law and order. His philosophy cast a long, oppressive shadow, creating a pressure cooker of simmering tensions, where the friction between the people and the powers that governed them was a constant, low hum of hostility. It was a place where hope felt like a foreign currency, and for those trapped in its cycle of poverty and systemic neglect, the search for an alternative, any alternative, was a desperate, primal need. It was in this crucible of discontent that a man named Vincent Leipart, a third-grade dropout and Korean War veteran, began to articulate a philosophy so radical it seemed alien to the world around it. Leipart was a quiet observer, a man who moved through the city's chaos with a profound and unsettling stillness. He saw the modern world not as progress, but as a disease, a complex artificial system built on exploitation, technology, and a profound disconnection from life itself. To him, the hum of a refrigerator was an act of violence against nature's silence. The chemical taste of processed food was a poison. The very concrete under his feet was a tombstone for the living earth. He believed that all of life, human, animal, even microbial, was sacred and interconnected, governed by a single perfect law, the law of God, or what he simply called the guideline. Though functionally illiterate, Leipart possessed a raw, magnetic intellect that transcended the written word. He dictated his thoughts, his revelations, into a sprawling, unedited manuscript that would become the Bible of his movement. In its pages, he laid out a total indictment of civilization. He argued that everything from cancer to pollution, from social injustice to mental illness, was a direct result of humanity's deviation from this natural law. The system, he preached, was inherently corrupt, and any participation in it was a form of self-destruction. To be free, one had to reject it all. He cast off his slave name, Vincent Leipart, and became John Africa, a name that symbolized a rebirth, a return to a primal, uncorrupted origin. It was a declaration of war, a shedding of an identity imposed by a world he deemed illegitimate. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was an idea, a living embodiment of a total revolution against the system. And people, disillusioned and searching for meaning in a city that seemed to offer none, began to listen. They were the forgotten, the marginalized, the ones who felt the system's boot on their necks every day. They gathered around him in cramped rooms, drawn not to political rhetoric, but to the unwavering certainty of his vision. He offered them more than an ideology. He offered them a family, a purpose, a new way of seeing the world and their place in it. They weren't just followers, they were converts. And this family, bound by a shared rejection of the world outside and a fierce loyalty to their teacher, would soon call itself MOVE. The name itself was not an acronym, but a declaration of principle. MOVE was a verb, a state of being, a commitment to a life in constant, natural motion, as defined by John Africa. To join was to undergo a profound rebirth, a shedding of a former self that the group saw as contaminated by the system. Members were required to cast off what they called their slave names, the surnames passed down through generations, which they viewed as brands of ownership from a corrupt society. In their place, they all adopted a single unifying surname, Africa. It was more than a name. It was a mark of allegiance, a public and permanent severing of ties with biological families, past histories, and the entire outside world. Their old lives were dead. This new family, with John Africa as its undisputed patriarch and teacher, was all that mattered. Their philosophy was codified in a sprawling, handwritten document known as the Guideline, a text that served as their unchangeable scripture. Its tenets were absolute and governed every conceivable aspect of life. All life, it preached, was sacred and interconnected. From the human members to the dogs they rescued, to the rats in the walls and the cockroaches on the floor, everything had a right to exist. Consequently, technology, modern medicine, and all forms of science were seen as unnatural and therefore evil, tools of a death-worshipping system designed to weaken and control humanity. They subsisted on a diet of raw foods, mostly fruits and vegetables, believing that cooking killed the life force within the food. Their children were not sent to public schools, which they decried as indoctrination centers, but were educated at home, their curriculum consisting solely of the teachings of John Africa. They wore their hair in long, flowing dreadlocks, a physical manifestation of their commitment to a natural, untampered existence. Their home in the Powelton Village neighborhood of Philadelphia became a living, breathing embodiment of this creed. It was an ark of belief, a self-contained ecosystem operating by its own laws, dropped into the middle of a conventional urban block. The small yard overflowed with refuse and compost, a deliberate rejection of artificial waste systems. The potent, earthy smell of decay hung heavy in the air, a constant olfactory assault on their neighbors. Dozens of rescued dogs, all considered family members, roamed freely through the house and property, their barking an endless chorus. The house itself, crowded with adults and children living communally, began to look less like a home and more like a fortress, not just for people, but for an idea that was fundamentally at war with its surroundings. But this self-contained world, built on principles of life and nature, was about to collide violently with the system it so despised, because their truth, which they began broadcasting through loudspeakers at all hours, sounded less like philosophy and more like a declaration of war to the city just outside their door. And this is where the quiet hum of their ideology began to sharpen into the deafening roar of confrontation. The sermons blasting from the MOVE compound were not gentle calls for natural living. They were a raw, unfiltered torrent of accusations against what they called the system, a relentless sonic assault that bled through walls and shattered the peace of an entire community. Day and night, the voices of MOVE members, amplified to an unbearable volume, listed their grievances in a cyclical, profane litany. They condemned the police as uniformed killers, the government as a machine of oppression, the schools as indoctrination centers. The entire artifice of modern society was a disease, and they were the cure. For the residents of Powelton Village, this was not a political statement. It was a form of psychological torture. Sleep became a luxury. Private thoughts were invaded, and the very air in their homes, already thick with the smell of compost, was now poisoned with a constant, aggressive sound. Complaints to the city, at first sporadic and hopeful, grew into a desperate chorus of citizens begging for relief. They were trapped in an ideological war zone they had never asked to be a part of, caught between a radical sect and an unresponsive city hall. But the city of Philadelphia was about to respond. Embodied by a man for whom compromise was a foreign concept, Mayor Frank Rizzo, a former police commissioner who built his political identity on brute force and an iron-fisted approach to law and order. Rizzo saw MOVE not as a community group with grievances, but as a direct challenge to his authority. To him, their defiance was a cancer that needed to be cut out. What began as a neighborhood dispute was now a symbolic battle for the soul of the city. The city issued arrest warrants for a handful of MOVE members on charges ranging from parole violations to disorderly conduct. But to MOVE, these legal documents were meaningless scraps of paper from a corrupt system. They were declarations of war. Their response was not a legal appeal, but a visual one. They appeared on their porch and rooftop, openly brandishing weapons, a clear, unambiguous signal that any attempt to enforce the warrants would be met with lethal force. In that moment, the conflict crossed a critical threshold. In response, the city's patience snapped. In May of 1977, police established a total blockade. The entire block was sealed off with barricades and a perimeter of armed officers. No one in, no one out. Food and water deliveries were cut. It was a slow, grinding siege designed to starve them into submission. For nearly a year, the standoff paralyzed the neighborhood, turning it into an occupied territory. The MOVE House, once a symbol of radical independence, was now a prison of their own making, surrounded by an army of police. The tension became a living entity, a suffocating presence that hung over the entire city, palpable in the silence between the loudspeaker tirades. The question was no longer if the situation would explode, but when, and how devastating the fallout would be. And in the sweltering heat of August 1978, the final order was given. The breaking point had been reached, and the system, MOVE, so vehemently rejected, was about to crash through their door with overwhelming, catastrophic force. The dawn of August 8th did not break, it shattered. Before the sun could cast its first light, hundreds of police officers, a disciplined sea of blue, swarmed the block, their silent, methodical movements a stark contrast to the chaotic energy emanating from the MOVE compound. Firefighters unrolled industrial-strength hoses, their brass nozzles gleaming under the streetlights, aimed at the house like cannons. This was not an eviction. It was a tactical assault, meticulously planned and overwhelmingly executed. The air, thick with the morning humidity, was now charged with the metallic taste of impending violence. The first wave of the attack was not bullets, but water. High-pressure jets slammed into the house with the force of a battering ram. A liquid demolition crew tearing away the wooden barricades, shattering windows, and turning the fortified home into a waterlogged ruin. The sound was a deafening roar, a man-made deluge intended to physically wash the resistance out into the street, to break their will through sheer elemental force. Inside, the MOVE members huddled in the basement, the structure above them groaning and splintering under the relentless assault, the world outside reduced to a thundering cascade. But they did not yield. Then, a single sharp crack cut through the noise of the water, a sound that changed everything. A single bullet tore through the fragile membrane of the standoff, and police officer James Ramp fell, fatally wounded. In that instant, the carefully orchestrated police operation dissolved into furious, unrestrained retaliation. The discipline vanished, replaced by a primal rage. A hailstorm of gunfire erupted from the police lines, a terrifying symphony of destruction. Thousands of rounds riddled the facade of the house, chewing through wood and plaster, turning walls into sieves. Tear gas canisters were launched, their acrid smoke flooding the already water-filled basement. turning the air into a suffocating chemical poison. The standoff had become a firefight, a brutal, one-sided war against a single row house. The battle raged for hours. Finally, as the water in the basement rose to their chests and the gas became unbearable, the survivors began to emerge. They were not the defiant revolutionaries from the rooftop. They were drenched, choking, terrified human beings, their bodies trembling from cold and fear. Men, women, and children stumbled out into the daylight, hands raised in surrender, blinking against a world that had just tried to annihilate them. But even in surrender, there was no peace. As a MOVE member named Delbert Africa emerged, unarmed and compliant, he was swarmed by a group of officers. In full view of news cameras broadcasting the scene live to a stunned city, he was thrown to the ground, kicked, stomped, and beaten with helmets and rifles. It was a raw, visceral display of vengeful fury, a moment where the uniform of the law became a mask for brutality. The image became an indelible stain on the city, proof that the system's response was not just about restoring order, but about punishment. In the aftermath, the house was bulldozed into rubble, as if to erase the very memory of the standoff. 9 MOVE members were charged and convicted for Officer Ramp's murder under a controversial legal theory, each sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison, despite the lingering, unanswered questions about where the fatal shot had truly come from. For the city of Philadelphia, the crisis seemed to be over. The noise was gone, the fortress was demolished, and the revolutionaries were behind bars. But the destruction of a house and the imprisonment of its members was not an ending. It was merely the prologue to a far greater fire. The embers of the Powelton Village siege did not die out. They were carried, like sacred coals, into the prison cells that held the MOVE 9. Behind bars, the convicted members became living martyrs, their decades-long sentences serving as the ultimate proof of the system's oppressive nature. Their letters from prison were treated as scripture, their suffering a constant source of fuel for the movement's fire. For the remaining members on the outside, the fight was no longer just an ideological crusade. It was a deeply personal mission to free their family. The organization did not crumble. Instead, it coalesced around this new, potent grievance. They regrouped, their resolve hardened into something brittle and sharp, and found a new home at 6221 Osage Avenue. And the cycle began again, this time in a neighborhood of proud, working-class, black homeowners. To the residents of Osage Avenue, who had built a life of quiet stability, the arrival of MOVE was a slow-motion invasion. The same patterns emerged, but with a more defiant, militant edge. The yard was once again allowed to return to a state of untamed nature, filled with refuse and stray animals, a stark, odorous contrast to the manicured lawns surrounding it. But this time, the house itself was transformed into a literal fortress. Barricades went up, windows were boarded over, and most ominously, a large, crude wooden bunker was constructed on the roof. A jagged, threatening silhouette against the sky, a sniper's nest looking down on the street. And from that fortress, the loudspeakers were reborn, once again spewing a relentless 24-hour stream of profane sermons and demands for the release of the MOVE 9. The new neighbors, who had saved for years to own their small piece of the American dream, found themselves living in a nightmare. They pleaded with the city for help. Their calls echoing the same desperation heard in Powelton Village years earlier. But this time, the city's leadership was different. The mayor was now Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first African-American mayor, a man who represented a promise of change and racial progress. He was caught in an impossible position, a political and racial crucible. On one side was a black radical group claiming to be victims of a racist system. On the other were the black residents of Osage Avenue, his own constituents, begging him to restore order to their lives. Every decision was fraught with peril. Every inaction seen as weakness. For months, the city tried to negotiate, to de-escalate, to avoid the violent optics of the 1978 raid. But MOVE, emboldened by their own mythology of persecution, refused any and all compromise. Their demands were absolute. Free the Move 9 or the war would continue. The pressure on Mayor Goode became unbearable. The city was seen as either incompetent or unwilling to protect its own citizens. Finally, a decision was made. The eviction would proceed. Warrants were issued. The city, haunted by the ghost of Officer James Ramp and the brutal images of the last siege, was determined to get it right this time. They developed a plan they believed was surgical. A plan to neutralize the rooftop bunker and force a surrender with minimal bloodshed. It was a plan born of technological confidence and a desperate desire to avoid the mistakes of the past. But this is the part of the story where good intentions pave a road to hell. Because the plan they devised, meant to be a precise solution, would instead become an act of civic immolation, an inferno that would consume not just a house, but an entire city block, and forever scar the soul of Philadelphia. Inside the house at 6221 Osage Avenue, the world had shrunk to a suffocating box of shadows and noise. For 13-year-old Birdie Africa, born Michael Moses Ward, but known only by his Move name, this was the only reality he had ever truly known. A state of perpetual siege, a life defined by the us inside and the them outside. He was one of 6 children, huddled in the dark, damp basement. The concrete walls vibrating with the percussive rhythm of the firefight raging above. The air was a stale mix of body odor, damp earth, and the acrid bite of tear gas that had seeped in hours ago. Above them, the adults, their voices hoarse from shouting slogans through megaphones, remained steadfast in their doctrine of resistance. But for a child, ideology is a cold, abstract comfort against the visceral terror of shaking walls, the splintering of wood, and the screams of adults whose certainty was beginning to crack. The day wore on, a timeless eternity of fear. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A low, whirring thrum from above. A helicopter. It hung in the air, a mechanical predator circling its prey. A decision had been made outside. A final, irreversible solution. From the belly of the aircraft, a satchel charge, a crude but powerful bomb of C4 and dynamite, was dropped onto the fortified rooftop bunker. The explosion was not a sharp crack, but a deep, gut-wrenching concussion that seemed to lift the entire house and slam it back down. Dust and plaster rained from the ceiling. A terrifying silence followed, a void where the gunfire had been. And then came the fire. It started as a whisper, a flicker on the roof that was barely noticeable at first. But it was fed by the house's old wooden frame, and fatefully by the gasoline cans stored inside for a generator. The fire department, positioned just blocks away, received an unthinkable order: stand down. Let the bunker burn. Use the fire as a tactical weapon to force them out. For those inside, this decision was a silent death sentence. The whisper of the fire grew into a roar. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour through the floorboards, a suffocating blanket descending into their basement sanctuary. The heat intensified with terrifying speed, turning the air into a searing poison that burned the eyes and choked the lungs. Panic, raw and primal, finally shattered the last vestiges of ideological defiance. The world turned into an oven. The children cried out for their mothers, their small voices lost in the cacophony of the inferno. Birdie's mother, Rhonda, tried to guide him and the others through the blinding, toxic haze toward a possible exit. But the heat was a physical wall, the smoke an invisible monster. In the chaos of the stampede for air, he was separated from her. He would never see her again. His only instinct was survival, a primal urge that overrode everything else. He saw another adult, Ramona Africa, moving toward a back alleyway, and he followed. They navigated through chest-deep water in the flooded basement, the fire raging above them, and squeezed through a narrow opening. He emerged from the smoke, a small, scared boy, his clothes singed, his hair gone, his body burned, collapsing into the arms of a firefighter who was weeping at the sight. He was the only child to survive. 11 people, including 5 children whose names were Zanetta, Delisha, Phil, Tommaso, and Tree, were consumed by the flames. A human sacrifice to a conflict where every side had lost its claim to humanity, leaving only the ashes of a neighborhood and the ghost of a boy who had lost everything. When the smoke finally cleared over Osage Avenue, it revealed more than just the charred skeletons of 61 homes. It revealed a deep, festering wound in the American social contract, a chasm between a people and the institutions meant to protect them. The aftermath was a hollow echo of the chaos. A special commission, convened to make sense of the senseless, called the city's actions unconscionable, a word that hung in the air with the weight of an indictment. Yet, in a bureaucratic sleight of hand that protected the powerful, no city official was ever criminally charged for the deaths of 11 people. The system investigated itself, and in a verdict that shocked the conscience, ultimately absolved itself. The bitter irony was absolute. Ramona Africa, the only adult survivor, was convicted of riot and conspiracy and sentenced to prison. And Birdie, the boy who walked out of the fire, was left an orphan, forced to carry the physical and psychological weight of a past that the world seemed eager to forget. The story of Move is not a simple morality play of heroes and villains. It is a terrifying and timeless case study in the destructive power of absolute certainty. It is the story of what happens when dialogue dies. On one side stood a belief system so rigid, so insular, that it had become a fortress, impenetrable to compromise or reason, ultimately sacrificing its own children on the altar of its principles. On the other stood a state apparatus so convinced of its own authority, so deafened by the righteousness of its own power, that it deployed a weapon of war against its own citizens, shattering the very peace it claimed to be upholding. It was a war between two non-negotiable realities, a dialogue of the deaf where the only language left was violence. Fought in a residential neighborhood, its only true casualties were the very people both sides, in their own distorted ways, claimed to be protecting. What then is the ultimate lesson left smoldering in the rubble? It is a stark, universal warning about the seduction of extremism in any form. It shows us that any ideology, whether it preaches a return to nature or the preservation of order, becomes monstrous at the precise moment it loses its capacity for empathy. The tragedy of MOVE is a chilling reminder that the line between a community and a cult, between law enforcement and state-sanctioned violence, is terrifyingly thin and easily erased in the heat of confrontation. It forces us to ask a question that still haunts our modern headlines. How much humanity are we willing to burn in the fire of our convictions? When a group rejects the legitimacy of the society around it, what is a proportionate response? And at what point does the state, in its effort to enforce its own rules, become the very monster it seeks to contain? The ghosts of Osage Avenue do not offer an easy answer. They only leave behind the profound silence of the ashes, a permanent testament to a day when a city declared war on itself and everyone lost. It is a story that should be remembered not as a bizarre anomaly of a bygone era, but as a permanent scar, a cautionary tale about the fragility of civil society and the catastrophic cost of letting our certainties consume our compassion. The fire may be out, but the questions it ignited burn to this day. If this story left an impact on you, subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the complex and often dark corners of our shared history.